Welcome back, everybody, to round 11 of the FIDE candidates. The intrigue on the board may have concluded, but I think we're all speechless. I speak for the commentators, the fans, whether you were rooting for Jan or for Vidit. That was a gladiator-like fight that we just witnessed with Ian Nepomniachtchi jumping through so many hoops. He was lost, then it was a draw. He wins with the black pieces against Vidit to claim sole lead going into the final 3 rounds. It's time for our game review segment, and we cannot but pay homage to this incredible performance by the tournament leader, the 2-time repeat winner of the candidates. Let's jump in to the fight that we just witnessed between Vidit, who has the white pieces, and Ian Nepomniachtchi with the black pieces. Let's go. We start out, to the surprise of exactly no one, with the Petrov. This is the weapon that Jan has relied on almost exclusively in the previous few candidates. So he's been very predictable, but he has shown that he is ready for every wrinkle that is thrown at him in the Petrov. And we see yet another wrinkle from Vidit. It was a very peculiar opening choice from the Indian Grandmaster. Of course, we are all used to the most common knight retreat to f3. This has been played by Prague in this very tournament. Jan himself faced the Petrov with white against Abasov, but in this game, Vidit plays a much less common move, knight c4. Still, this is on everybody's radar. It's been played by many top GMs. But after Jan plays the main move, knight takes e4, queen to e2 is the main continuation, pinning the knight, and Jan responds with queen e7. It was very strange because Vidit didn't seem to show anything special here. He went for knight to c3, which is a pretty rare move, and this just leads to liquidation and an endgame that is maybe at most a tiny bit better for white, but largely is equal. Jan grabs the knight on c3, and here the novelty bishop g4. Nothing special. This encourages the queen trade, and after the queens are swapped, it's not entirely clear what exactly Vidit was aiming for. So with the queens off, a lot of people assumed that this game was just going to end peacefully, but the fun is only beginning. In fact, it hasn't yet begun. Here's what happens next. First, we get a relatively standard few moves. Vidit plays rook b1, Jan defends the pawn with b6, and slowly but surely, Vidit slides into a somewhat worse position. He pushes the pawn, grabbing space. In the center, Jan drops his bishop back, x-raying the knight. Notice this very, very weakened pawn structure on the queen side. It is compensated by white's active pieces, but it eventually begins to make its presence felt. Vidit pushes his pawn up to a4, liberating the knight, grabbing some space. Jan tucks his king away on the king side, pretty standard so far. Knight e3 is met with bishop to g5, again, pursuing this knight, not letting white develop easily. And around this point, Vidit slides into a worse position. c4 is met with rook e8. Now these pawns are even more vulnerable. There's tension down the middle with an x-ray against white's king. Vidit pushes another pawn up to h4, but he gets overextended. Bishop f6, c3, and an excellent shot by Jan, c5. At this point, Vidit is under an hour and under a tremendous amount of pressure. Hikaru mentioned that he thought Jan was going to win the game at this point. Well, spoiler alert, he did, but not in the way that anybody expected. It's a very difficult position for Vidit. He can't really push d5 because the c3 pawn will be captured with check. That d4 pawn is simply lost. But Vidit defends very accurately. He ignores the threat and plays bishop to d3, a move that took him another 20 minutes to find. And at this point, Jan could have solidified a pretty significant advantage by nonetheless taking twice on d4. A move that at first appears impossible on account of bishop e4 trapping the rook, but it doesn't trap the rook. Black responds with the counter-strike d5, and it turns out that after c takes d5, bishop d7, white's pieces are kind of all in the middle. They're all hanging. The a4 pawn is hanging, and white's position is very unenviable. The bishop has to drop back, for example. Black completes his development with the very nifty knight maneuver to a6. It can rejoin the game via c5. And this is a very, very unpleasant position that likely Jan would have won. But perhaps due to a misevaluation, Jan developed his knight up to c6. No, this is not a piece blunder, but Vidit nonetheless pushes d5. Jan's idea is to position the knight on e5, counterattacking white's bishop. Now, of course, if white takes the bishop on e6, Jan recaptures on d3, and the knight can easily evacuate via f4 or e5. But Vidit continues to play very accurately with little time on his clock. He grabs the pawn on h7, classic desperado. Then he captures on e6. And this position may seem very ugly for white, but it's actually very hard for black to make progress. The pawn on c4 is safely defended. The other pawns are hard to get to, and white does have this 3 versus 1 majority on the king side that eventually allows Vidit to take over the initiative. First things first, he brings the king up to the center of the board, preventing the knight check to d3, restricting this knight. Jan brings his rook into the center, preparing d6, d5, but Vidit strikes first. Here come his kingside pawns. g4 is an excellent move, preparing to knock this bishop off of the long diagonal. Jan doesn't allow that to happen. He plays g6, making a Luft square for his bishop. But now we get the possibility of an eventual pawn breakthrough with h5. This will become very significant a couple of moves down the line. Another excellent move by Vidit, just the way that he uses his pawns throughout this game is really, really impressive. So let's spotlight some of these brilliant moves by Vidit that were found in acute time pressure. At this point, he's got barely over 20 minutes for 17 moves. This is a pawn sacrifice made in order to access the 7th rank, rook b7. Now, the immediate threat is neutralized by Jan, who moves his rook up to d7, triggering an exchange of rooks. But once the rooks are traded, the initiative continues. Now Vidit switches to the semi-open d-file, hitting the pawn on d6, forcing black to compromise the activity of his fianchettoed bishop. Here, one of the issues is that if black defends through e5, the knight will slide up to g4, and suddenly black's central position collapses. You're going to lose some pawns. That's out of the question. Jan is forced to slink his bishop back to its initial square. This is a good move, but after knight g4, it's very clear that white has excellent compensation for the sacrificed pawn and a very clear plan of action. The bishop is going to move up to f4. The pawn on d6 is a major weakness, and Jan's a pawns are very, very far from promotion. On we go. Rook e8 to b8. Jan trying to maximize the activity of his rook, pinning his hopes eventually on these a pawns. Vidit follows through with his plan. Bishop f4 is followed by a check to the white king, which moves up to f3. Notice how white is kind of massing his pieces and pawns on the king side. And Jan pushes the pawn up to e5, temporarily solving the problem of his d-pawn, but making even more weaknesses in his position. Now his light squares are very weak. Now his knight on d7 is basically stuck there, preventing its vis-a-vis from jumping in to the very nasty outpost on f6. Vidit drops his bishop back to e3. At this point, the position is still dynamically equal. Knight b6 is a mistake by Jan, and now things go from uneasy equality to an objectively worse, perhaps even losing position. Vidit punishes him very nicely. He gives the check on f6, forcing the king back to h8. The correct move, by the way, would have been to start by pushing the pawn up to a4. This was very hard to see, even with a lot of time on his clock, because in this position, black can actually get out of the danger zone via g7. By starting with knight b6, Jan was not able to slide the king to g7. Now he would have run into this fork. These kinds of subtleties, so hard to spot. He was forced to go back into the corner. Vidit centralizes his king with king e4. And now we get to the most interesting phase of the game, which lasts something like 20 moves. a4 by Ian Nepomniachtchi. That's his only asset. He has to start pushing his pawns. At this point, after rook a1, stopping the pawn, and rook b3, Vidit had this very powerful resource, h5, which would have gotten him onto a borderline winning position. Now, in time pressure, perhaps he had a hard time evaluating the position after rook takes c3, h takes g6, rook takes c4, king f5, rook h4. It's just a wild position, and the only winning move here is f4, which I'm not going to pretend to understand. I think the actual point is that after the exchange, white has a very clear path to e8, as well as the threat of bishop g3. And the rook has to stay on the h file. An easy way to understand that is to see what would have happened after g takes h5, rook h1. Here, black gets mated summarily after a3, king f5, a2, rook h5, king g7, and rook h7. So understandably, Vidit did not see all of these details and decided on the more conservative king d3, protecting his queenside pawns. This gave Jan an important tempo that he uses to push his pawn to a3. But after bishop c1, Jan makes another mistake. He pushes his other pawn to a5, perhaps expecting Vidit to take on a3, which he does, and pinning his hopes on this very, very deep tactic d5. And now what we thought was going to be the most important moment of the game turns out this actually isn't. But in this position, with only 6 minutes on his clock for 5 moves, Vidit understandably dodges the complications and drops back to c2, bringing the position back to a state of dynamic equality. Instead, the move which supposedly won the game, although I looked at this briefly and the complications here are so immense that even the engine struggles, knight takes d5, sacrificing a piece, quote unquote, falling into the trap. And after knight d5 cd, Jan was relying on the resource c4 check You could also start with rook takes a3. It doesn't matter. And after rook takes a3, bishop takes a3. Nope, that would not be Jan's choice. White slides the king up to b5, immobilizing the pawn on a5 and preparing to run his connected passers up the board. Now, if black cooperates with a slow move like king g7, white is winning after c4. But the testing move here is e5, e4. This would be a terrifying move to face in time pressure. Although by this point, Vidit would have made time control. The point of this move is to meet king takes a5 with bishop c5. And actually, black wins the game here because the f2 pawn is captured and all the other pawns fall like a house of cards. It turns out that white is forced to play c4. Black can now deflect the king with the move a4. After king takes a4, bishop c5, the position is once again drawn, and actually white has to fight for survival. So Vidit would have had to see c5, bishop takes c5, and this triggers a pawn race, which results in simultaneous promotion. So we would have gotten this queen endgame. The engine claims that white is winning, but likely the game would have still been going by the time I'm doing my recap if, in fact, Vidit opted for this continuation. So the small consolation for him is that knight takes d5 was not cleanly winning, but it would have pushed Jan to the brink of a loss. Instead, after king c2, we quickly make time control in a very interesting endgame. Now, I don't have time to delve into all the complexities of this endgame, but the bird's eye view is that Jan starts taking over the initiative. Vidit starts burning a lot of time. He's still playing for a win, so he declines repetition at this point. Knight g3 is his choice. Knight d2 would have led to a 3-time repetition and a draw. And after he declines that repetition, Jan slides his rook into b3, gets his knight active, and at this point, you can kind of sense that the momentum shifts in black's favor. Vidit has 12 minutes. Jan's king is getting active via these light squares, which were originally supposed to be the path that white's king took. And the way that Jan prosecutes this initiative is nothing short of masterful. So let's fast forward a couple of moves. The pawn, it gets to a4. It's protected by the knight. Vidit tries to poke and prod at some of black's weak pawns. Jan slides his rook calmly up to b5, kind of sitting on the position, maintaining the initiative. He gets his rook behind the pass pawn, forcing white's king to an even more compromised location on a3. Now Jan cuts the king off by bringing his rook back to b5, creating the potential for an exchange sacrifice on b5 and making white's defensive task even harder. And now we get to the most interesting part of the game. Once the king maximizes its activity and provokes this weakening move, Jan finds an incredible idea. Now, we were discussing in the commentator booth that bishop f8 would have maximized his objective advantage because white has no helpful move to make. White is essentially in Zugzwang, but this was incredibly hard to spot. And instead, Jan came up with an even more impressive idea. He sacrifices both pawns that seem to be the only pawns that are important for him, the c4 pawn and the a4 pawn. He sacrifices them in succession. Knight to d5 allows the king to take a4 and allows the knight to take on c4. But this is all part of his plan. Step one of his plan involves deflecting the knight from d2 so that he can push e4 and activate his king. Step two of the plan involves hunting for the white king on a4. Black's king threatens to get involved in the attack via d3. And with only 3 minutes on the clock at this point, both players in time pressure for the rest of the game, this is such a difficult position for white to defend. It is still objectively drawn, and here's how things unfold from this part. Vidit drops his bishop back to f2. This is correct. It's essentially the only move. Bishop g1 would have led to the same thing. Jan continues with his king journey to d3. Remember where he initiated this journey. His king used to be on h8. It could have gotten checkmated. Now it finds itself the star of the show on d3. The knight is hanging. It has to move. But Vidit finds a fascinating intermezzo, bishop to g3, which also maintains the objectively drawn position. Instead, knight e5 check would have led to some impossible calculations. We dubbed this the police chase line because after king d2, the rook slides over, and amazingly, white's king is able to escape forward to a8, and it doesn't get mated after king a6, rook b6. I'm going to quickly show a critical line. Here, black has nothing better than to repeat moves with knight b5 and knight c7. But instead, Vidit finds the intermezzo bishop g3, and the point is, if the rook slides away from the b file, the king moves back to b3, and white is safe and sound. Jan takes the pawn on c3, delivering a check to the white king. And at this point, we were all sure that Vidit was going to liquidate with rook takes c3. King takes c3, bishop takes b8, king takes c4 leads to a bishop endgame that with only seconds on the clock, Vidit wasn't sure how to evaluate. In fact, it is a pretty straightforward draw if the white bishop drops back to e5. There's the idea of the pawn breakthrough with h5, and white has several ways to hold the draw in this position. But with only seconds left and the pressure at a maximum, Vidit panics and drops his king back to a3, an unthinkable move, which, believe it or not, is still not the decisive mistake from a technical point of view. But practically speaking, after rook b4, the game is essentially over. It turns out that Vidit's idea to deliver a retreating check on b2 and then to trap black's king with bishop f4 no longer works. Jan had the presence of mind to cover that square by putting his rook on b4, and with that idea failing, Vidit fails. The actual losing move is knight b2 check. I checked this position with a powerful engine and found that white can still draw the game with an absolutely miraculous sequence. This really is the cherry on top. It turns out that the drawing sequence was knight e5 check, king d2, rook g1, and c4. Now we have essentially the game position, with the big difference being that the knight is on e5 rather than on b2. And at this point, the draw is yielded by bishop e1 check. Now black's king calmly slides away to e2. Bishop takes knight, rook b1 check. I saw this, probably even Vidit saw this, but at this point, there is an incredible resource, bishop to b4. The point is to deflect black's bishop and trigger an exchange of minor pieces that is going to allow white to somehow save and hold the position. If instead you started with king a4, this position is losing. Knight takes c4, king d3 forks these minor pieces, but starting with bishop b4 forces black to take with the bishop, sliding the king up to a4, rook takes rook, king takes bishop, and this is a draw because both of these pawns are going to fall, and you're going to get a knight versus rook position that's theoretically drawn. Doesn't matter what black does, rook h1, king takes c4, and when the smoke clears, white is simply going to round up this pawn on g6. Understandably, Vidit missed this move. He continued with knight b2, and Jan delivered perfectly. His next few moves were ideally performed, played really quickly, and he gave Vidit no more chances. Everything is involved in the attack. White's king is completely busted, and after Jan blocked this check, Vidit was forced to start giving up pieces. c3, rook f7, rook back to b7, discover check, protecting the bishop, and now simply ignoring the knight. The pawn pushes forward, and it simply cannot be stopped. The king evacuates back to the center of the board, and in this position, a devastated Vidit, we all feel for him, resigned the game, handing a sole tournament lead to Ian Nepomniachtchi going into the final 3 rounds of the tournament. I merely scratched the surface. This game is going to be analyzed and reanalyzed for perhaps even years to come, but hopefully this gives you a brief insight into how Ian Nepomniachtchi, in the most improbable fashion, turned the game around and actually defeated Vidit with the black pieces. He's 2 out of 2 against Vidit in this tournament. He has a clear first place by half a point, but some hard work yet to be done. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your game recap for round 11.